Welcome everybody to today's Science Outside Your Comfort Zone webinar presented to you by the Westmead Research Hub, featuring Professor Ben Eggleton from Sydney Nano, talking today on the theme, Nanohealth, harnessing science at the nanoscale for a healthier and sustainable future. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Darug people, who are the traditional owners of this land. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters in New South Wales. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the work of the Westmead Research Hub, we are a collaboration based at Westmead here in Western Sydney, made up of 7 of the institutions involved in conducting medical research on the Westmead precinct. The Research Hub coordinates collaborative projects across many areas of the medical research ecosystem. For example, enabling researchers to access our scientific core facilities, bringing together our commercialization staff for collaborative initiatives such as training and workshops, as well as organising research conferences and events such as this Science Outside Your Comfort Zone webinar. Today, you are participating in the inaugural Science Outside Your Comfort Zone seminar, which we hope will become a series of events where we will invite an eminent scientist to Westmead to give a talk on an issue of science and medical research that are not commonly considered among medical researchers, such as nanoscience. A little housekeeping before we start. If you have any questions today, we would love for you to ask those through the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar, and Ben and our panelists will answer some of these questions at the end of the webinar. Speaking of panelists, the second half of today's event will include a panel discussion featuring some of the most brilliant minds from across Westmead and the university's Camperdown campus, moderated by Westmead researcher and Hub executive member, Professor Tania Sorrell. You may be watching this webinar as you work from home in lieu of the in-person event that we had originally planned. And so I encourage all of you to think of today's webinar as an opportunity to come together with your research community and to learn something new that we can take into our own work life, upskilled and further educated on an area of science that may be outside your comfort zone. Ben Eggleton is the director of the University of Sydney Nano Institute. He also currently serves as co-director of the New South Wales Smart Sensing Network. Ben is the author and co-author of more than 500 journal publications, including articles in Nature Photonics, Nature Physics, Nature Communications, as well as over 200 invited presentations, 201 after today. His journal papers have been cited 24,000 times, and Ben has filed over 35 patents. Ben has won a pile of awards, most recently together with a team of researchers from the University of Sydney and ANU. Ben's team won the Australian Museum's 2020 Defence Science and Technology Eureka Prize for Outstanding Science in Safeguarding Australia. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Ben Eggleton to give today's webinar. Ben, are you there?
Hi, James, I am here. Can you hear me and can you see me?
Loud and clear.
Great.
Take it away.
Great. Thanks, James. And thank you for organising this. It's actually a real honour to be the inaugural speaker for this wonderful event. Speaking to you today from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I want to acknowledge also elders past and present and pay my respect. This is a really special occasion for me. I hope this is fun. I hope this is going to be interesting, exciting. I know everyone's dealing with their circumstances. And so the next hour and a half, what I'd like to do in this first session, at least, is give you an overview of what we're doing at Sydney Nano. And of course, I'm going to focus on our research. I'm going to focus on the Institute's structure and purpose, and I'm going to exemplify what we do through a Nanohealth lens. And I thought the byline really here is the why, the what, the how, and the who. So I want to start by talking about why we are doing this research, put it in the context of the university's strategy, why this is important. I'm obviously going to talk about what we're doing, and I'll talk a little bit about nanoscience, nanotechnology, and really tease out some of our flagship projects. I want to talk about how we do it. I think that's what's really quite interesting and exciting. And I think this is the conversation we need to have afterwards in the panel is as much about the substance of what we work on, but it's also about how we work together, how we collaborate, how we come together with external partners, how we engage end users, how we work with clinicians. And then, of course, who are we? And along the way, I'm going to mention as many of my colleagues as I can because I want to give them visibility for their amazing work. And I want to leave you with a sense of a community of academics and researchers and professional staff that you can reach out to connect with Sydney Nano following the conversation that we're having today. So with that, let me go forward. Now, let me start with the why. And I think simply speaking, at a University of Sydney level, this conversation, this initiative, Sydney Nano, falls very clearly into the university's current strategic plan that was formulated over the last 5 years ago. We've got a new vice chancellor, and I think it's fair to say he embraces this strategy. And if you look at that particular strategy, it talks about transformational and translational research as a priority. And in that strategy, there is the commitment to establish the multidisciplinary initiatives that I will be representing today through a Sydney Nano lens. And at our core, we are large-scale, multidisciplinary, cross-faculty initiatives that aim to coalesce researchers together around grand challenge-like initiatives that are externally focused. So I want to talk that through in this session. In a more recent times, it's interesting to reflect on a national conversation. This is taken from a recent Group of 8 Australia report that was put to government earlier this year. And I understand BBC Duncan Iverson was part of the working group. And it talks about how the universities, in particular the Group of 8, are really well positioned to drive a post-COVID recovery. And if you look at this, and I encourage you to download this report, which is publicly available, it indeed emphasises collaboration, bringing together expertise to tackle societal and environmental problems of great complexity. It talks about mission-directed research, which I think the multidisciplinary initiatives, the Nano in particular, exemplify. And it talks about involving the broader public directly in the work that we're doing. And I want to give an example later on of some work we did last year in the context of COVID-19 that indeed brought the public into the conversation. So with that perspective, I think most of you understand, roughly speaking, the university landscape, and you're probably familiar with a number of the multidisciplinary initiatives. The Brain and Mind Centre, Charles Perkins Centre are clearly world-leading large-scale initiatives that have enormous visibility and influence at a national, at a global level. There are also 3 prominent multidisciplinary initiatives that are sitting within the social sciences. Of course, they're all multi-faculty, but they're all doing amazing things, and they're bringing together researchers. They're engaging the public. And Sydney Nano is very proudly part of this multidisciplinary framework. And I want to dive in now and talk a little bit more about our mission, our purpose, and some of the underlying science that is really at the core of what we do. So if we were sitting in my office in the Sydney Nanoscience Hub, and that would be lovely to imagine we could have that conversation in my office, I'd probably start the conversation by pointing to a plaque on my wall, which is actually dedicated to Neil Armstrong. My mum gave it to me about 5 years ago. And it's lovely. It's a monument to Neil, and I've got a signature from Neil Armstrong. And really, it's there to celebrate that heroic achievement for all mankind, for our species on this planet. It's a great way to start the conversation, because I think what we're trying to do with Sydney Nano, we like to think is the next giant leap, but it is seriously small. But I think that paradigm shift that is represented by that Neil Armstrong moon landing, I think is a very exciting way to think about what we're trying to do here. So let's sort of dive in and understand the nanoscale. Well, very simply, the nanoscale, as we all know, as people familiar with science and engineering, is talking about a length scale that is compatible with the dimensions of a virus or a protein or a DNA. And as I'll show you, it's actually comparable to the dimensions of some of the technologies that we actually have in many consumer products. It's also worth noting that the concept of nanotechnology, the concept that you can actually take a bunch of molecules, combine them to create a functional component, which is really the essence of what nanotechnology is, was first proposed in 1959 by Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, mostly renowned for his research in quantum physics. At an after-dinner speech in Pasadena, he basically coined this term, "there's plenty of room at the bottom," and that was really the beginning of this new field. It's fair to say, of course, the chemists would argue that nanotechnology, nanomaterials has been with us for a lot longer, and as I'll explain, it's been with us for thousands of years. But that was really the beginning of this nanotechnology race. And it's also fair to say it's only been in the last 10 to 20 years that capability, technology, infrastructure, equipment, instrumentation has caught up with that vision. And now we have the ability, using some of the facilities on campus, such as in the Sydney Nanoscience Hub, to actually implement some of these fantastic ideas. So as I said, nanotechnology has been with us in nature. Some great examples summarized on this slide. And I'll come back to some of these in terms of one of our flagship projects that actually exploits some of the ideas that are represented on the bottom of this slide, with hydrophobicity of lotus plants, for example, that naturally occurs in nature. And of course, we're familiar with the notion that butterflies achieve that color not through pigmentation, but through structure. We also know that there are naturally occurring nanoparticles in volcanic ash, for example. I'll come back to nanoparticles because that's one of our key priority areas. And it turns out we've been using nanotechnology somewhat often without necessarily knowing in our life in the context of art structures that we create. For example, the color revealed in this wine glass is actually associated with plasmonic resonance of nanoscale metallic particles. And of course, the introduction of liposome and drug delivery goes back to 1960s, really coinciding with that fascinating speech by Richard Feynman. Now, if we fast forward, we see that nanotechnology is all around us. Some great examples. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. It's a great one. I'll send these slides around. You'll have them available. But just to pick out a few examples for me that are very amazing. The iPhone that you all have, if you smash it open, look at the chip under a microscope, the transistors that are doing the processing in that phone are of the order of 10 nanometer in scale. So your phone is very much enabled by nanotechnology. If we think of solar panels, for sure, there's nanotechnology playing a key role. Imaging theranostics, display technology, sunscreen comprises nanoparticles, and waterproof electronics and graphene materials. And so nanotechnology is playing an important role across a whole range of application areas. It's a vital part of our ecosystem, of our industry, and it is affecting our lives for good. Okay, so the journey at the University of Sydney started arguably about a decade ago with the investment in the Sydney Nanoscience Hub, which was funded through the federal government and the University of Sydney, roughly speaking, the $100 million investment in absolutely state-of-the-art infrastructure on the main campus. And I invite you all to visit when we're back on campus. I get no greater joy than showing my colleagues and key stakeholders around the Sydney Nanoscience Hub. Now, it was designed very specifically to support a number of agendas such as quantum computing. We're very proud that we host the Microsoft Quantum Computing program in the Sydney Nanoscience Hub. Very strong programs in nanophotonics, both in the School of Physics and the School of Electrical Engineering. The core facilities are particularly focused on nanofabrication in integrated circuits. The Sydney Nano Institute itself was launched in 2016. We rebranded from AINST, which was a bit of a mouthful, the Australian Institute of Nanoscale Science and Technology. I think Sydney Nano is much punchier. And as I'll show you, we've been on an interesting journey because although we started very much with the physical sciences, arguably a physics perspective on nano, what you'll see is that indeed, we now look through a whole of university lens. I think we exemplify the multidisciplinary that was at the heart of that University of Sydney strategy. And I'm thrilled that we have such good engagement in health and medicine. And that is clearly a priority for Sydney Nano, an example of that multidisciplinarity that I talked about. So let's just a little bit of detail. The Sydney Nanoscience Hub is shown in there. It's a fantastic facility, supports a number of world-class research groups and core facilities, and it is the headquarters for Sydney Nano. At our core, we are an enabler of that multidisciplinary collaboration, emphasising both transformative and translational outcomes that are going to impact society and the economy. And I'm going to give you some examples of those initiatives. It's important to note, and I go around prosecuting this all the time, I have these three simple principles that I constantly have to reinforce. As an MDI that sits outside of the faculty, the school that sits within the research portfolios, these three principles that do no harm. We can't impede what is happening at the faculty or school level. We have to operate in a sweet spot where we are adding real value by building collaboration, particularly across faculties and schools in that multidisciplinary sense. So we don't duplicate what exists already in schools and faculties, and all the benefits flow to schools and faculties. We have some amazing partnerships. I mentioned Microsoft. We're very proud of the various partnerships we have with the Australian Defence Force. We're very proud of the commercialization success stories that are associated with Sydney Nano, the networks that we host, and the other ARC and other national initiatives that are directly or indirectly supported by Sydney Nano. And the final point that I'll come back to is, as an institute that is very much focused externally on addressing those grand challenges, we look to the UN Sustainability Goals as explicit drivers of our research. And I will come back to that because I think that whole UN Sustainability Goal agenda is an important one as it overlays across our research framework. So we can summarize Sydney Nano in a slide. This is a busy slide. The more interesting for those that are interested in academic strategies, but I'll just talk to it. We've got a quote there from our chief scientist, Kathy Foley, who was on a panel last year that reviewed Sydney Nano and talked about Sydney Nano as a unique multidisciplinary institute addressing the scientific, societal, and economic grand challenges of our times. And just to reiterate, our purpose is to enable the transformational activities and translational outcomes in nanoscience and nanotechnology that would not otherwise be possible through existing faculty and university structures. So I've got an amazing team of professional staff that support Sydney Nano, operationalising, executing our strategy. We've got fantastic engagement with ECR, community students, and international ambassadors. And of course, I've got my academics that sit with me on the executive deputy directors that are leading specific portfolios. We've got an academic strategy. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. I'm going to focus very much on our grand challenge framework because I think it really exemplifies our commitment to those global challenges and that translational, transformational narrative. And of course, we've got our membership and our stakeholders, our key stakeholders are our members. They are the key stakeholders for Sydney Nano, the members who are the academic staff who sit in the schools and faculties. And we have a whole range of priorities, as well as great research in terms of talent development, the ECRs that I talked about, our engagement with partners here in Australia and overseas. So we do act very much in the international and national context. And this is a slide that just reiterates the point that I just made. Those UN Sustainability Goals are fantastic priorities to align our research with. And as you'll see in the next few slides, as I talk to some of our research flagships, we clearly are aligned with the sustainability goals mentioned here in terms of good health and well-being, clean water. You'll see that affordable clean energy, life on land. You'll see these priorities clearly represented through the Sydney Nano signature projects. We aligned with those national research priorities, and at a local level, it's important to note that we align obviously with the faculty strategies. I'll give you an example of a fantastic partnership with the Faculty of Medicine and Health. Professor Mark Rees and I have worked together over the last year and a half to formulate and operationalize the Nanohealth network. I'll talk about a great example of aligning with the Faculty of Medicine and Health, but also aligning with the other faculties. We clearly align with the significant investment at a national level in defence, with a number of flagship projects associated with Sydney Nano that are funded directly by defence or with defence agencies. We align with the quantum economy, the quantum computing research that you heard me mention, the Sydney Quantum Academy, great investment there, world leading science, they are key stakeholders, and obviously health and medicine, as I've mentioned, and as we'll tease out over the next 20 minutes, is a clear priority for a university like Sydney that has, roughly speaking, about 45 to 50% of its academic staff associated with Faculty of Medicine and Health, where we are surrounded by world-class hospitals. Nanohealth, nanomedicine, naturally a priority, and we'll see, and of course that emphasis on impact and feeding into that ERA. So I'll take a breath now and talk a little bit about the strategy that we put together in 2018 to drive the Sydney Nano research agenda towards the transformational, translational, mission-directed narrative that I talked about. And so the way we approach that is through the so-called grand challenges. And the grand challenge framework, it's not a new concept. It's a concept that's used in major research organizations around the world. It's simply a narrative that says, let's frame our research explicitly in terms of those grand challenges that resonate with the key stakeholders. So if we think about living in this world today, those grand challenges are going to be along the lines of clean water, climate change, the environment, challenges associated with aging population. There are going to be fundamental challenges linked to Moore's law that are constraining computers. There are going to be challenges linked to infectious disease and toxins that are associated with nanotechnology we need to understand. And so really it was that grand challenge narrative that framed Sydney Nano's research explicitly in a way that directed research towards these missions that I talked about right at the beginning. And I think that's been very powerful and very successful. And I think it's resonating with our key stakeholders. It's certainly resonating with our researchers and deans and heads of schools. And I think testament to that is that we've seen other examples across the university of this grand challenge construct being used. And it's also definitely resonating with our external partners, whether that's the donors or the funding agencies that we deal with. It's a really compelling approach to formulating research. And without going into too much detail, because I've got you a 2-minute movie in a minute, what's interesting is that when we look at the Grand Challenge framework that was rolled out back in 2019, and what was surprising early on was that we could see that Sydney Nano's research fell into two major areas of strength, where we genuinely had multidisciplinary, multi-faculty engagement, and that is across the material science and life science. And that was really the beginning of this new phase of our journey, the recognition that the life sciences, in particular the engagement with medicine and health, represented really a new frontier for the university to really coordinate a significant flagship initiative. So I'm going to just take a breath, and what I'm going to do is go to the next slide, and I've got a short little movie that I hope is going to run. Let's see if this runs. And James, let me know the sound should come through.
At Sydney Nano, our researchers are solving the world's biggest problems at the nanoscale. Let's take a look at our 6 grand challenges. The supply of clean water, especially in dry regions, is one of the major global concerns of this century. We're developing devices to capture water from thin air through passive condensation on nano-patterned surfaces. This will alleviate the effects of drought, providing water for humans, animals and plants. Unsustainable healthcare costs have triggered a paradigm shift away from the break-fix model to early intervention. So, we are developing nano-robots small enough 1 million could fit on the head of a pin. They travel through the body for non-surgical detection and treatment of diseases, long before the first symptoms appear. Millions of people suffer from neurological diseases, such as impaired vision. So we're creating a nanowire network inside a chip that can be implanted into the brain to help restore vision. By unlocking the neural code, we can rethink intervention into the human nervous system to make untreatable diseases treatable. To combat climate change, we need to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. So we're developing nanocatalysts that reduce CO2 formation during manufacturing. They can also convert the polluting gas into valuable products, such as fuel. Today, most new materials are discovered by trial and error. We're envisioning a world where new materials can be designed atom by atom using quantum computers, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Doing so will help us discover, design, and build the nanomaterials we need to transform our world for the better. While nanoparticles are used in products such as food and cosmetics, little is known about their impact on our health and the environment. So we're developing solutions to determine the safety of nanomaterials. This will allow us to assist governments with the creation of regulation frameworks. We'll also design safer nanomaterials and help educate consumers. To do all this, we need support from collaborators, industry partners, sponsors, and some of the world's brightest students and researchers. Together, we can find groundbreaking solutions at the nanoscale.
Great, I think that worked. So let me go to the next slide. So the next part of the presentation, I'm keeping a close eye on the time change, so I know that we've got pretty abrupt. I want to just talk briefly to some of those grand challenges in more detail. I'm going to focus really on two that I think exemplify. They're all outstanding, the 6 that you heard briefly about, but I'll focus on 2 that are captured here that you heard briefly about. On the first, I'll talk about the capture of water. And so this is a fantastic collaboration. Let's see if I can go to the next slide. That was just illustrated in that animation here. And this is actually a prototype sitting on the roof of the City Nanoscience Hub, really exemplifying that as much as this is transformational, this is translational. So we are now prototyping these passive water capture devices. So the concept, as you've seen, is the nanostructured coating that allows for this hydrophobic property that was indicated earlier on, associated with this particular amphibian in nature. It captures water and it requires no energy input. And this is a fantastic project. This group of physicists, chemists, and some engineers came together. We're recipients of a national prize in 2020. And I'm not sure if they're happy for me to say this, but this is being pushed in a commercial direction, and we wish them all the best as they really take this translationally out there to drive impact. And you can imagine the kind of impact this is going to be able to have in the local community, let alone thinking about applications in developing countries. Great example of nanotechnology. The second example, more transformational, is work led by Shelley Wickham and Anna Waterhouse, another exemplifying collaboration between a physicist, a medical researcher, focused on completely reimagining healthcare. And to some extent, it was prompted by some early engagement from Sydney Nano with the university's health and medical community that was looking at this fascinating idea: what if we could miniaturize a robot to the size of a cell? And Professor Paul Bannon, some of you would know, chair of cardiovascular surgery, was one of the academic clinicians who was consulted. And in the report that was submitted based on that work, he was quoted as saying, if I could miniaturize myself inside the body, I could detect early treatable damage in your coronary arteries when you are 25 years old and thus avoid your premature death. And so that really set off this outstanding team of researchers. And I could talk for half an hour. Anna and Shelley are more qualified than I am to talk on this for sure. But just to give you a hint of what is at the heart of this fascinating research, they're building these nanoscale robots using DNA origami bricks. that can self-assemble under certain conditions. And so this sort of artist's impression here of a robot, which has a core, and the core is indeed the origami bricks that are illustrated in these scanning electron microscope images. You can see the self-assembly of sophisticated structures, but also it turns out they can actually create an interactive robot that has the ability to sense and to move through the body. And this has been tested, obviously, in laboratory conditions. And I think of this as really some of the most exciting transformational research that Sydney Nano has enabled. And we're very proud of Shelley and Nano and what they're achieving, and expect great things to come in the future. So we take a deep breath, just a bit of a strategic perspective as we kind of get to the Nanohealth and wrap up. We are, as an institute, straddling across translational and transformative outcomes. And if you actually take our Sydney Nano framework and look at all of the nodes that we support, of which there are now 17, 18, roughly speaking, we put them across this sort of translational transformative scale. You see that we nicely spread. On the one hand, we've got examples of very transformative research along the lines of the nanorobotics that I just talked about. Probably they're modest on the translational scale, but still, arguably, they are somewhat translational in that they have an impact pathway. They have consulted with end users. They understand quite deeply the use case for their research. We also have research that is more translational, such as the aqua technology, water capture. So fair to say there is transformative research, but it is very much now focused on translating that, and that's fantastic. And we have other initiatives that straddle across that whole ecosystem. And I'm very comfortable with the balance of research across that whole spectrum. So that segues nicely to really the origins of the Nanohealth conversation, which started, as I mentioned, following that grand challenge framework and the realization that life sciences was clearly an area of strength where we have critical mass at the university. And as I mentioned, Professor Mark Rees, myself, Professor Wojtek Kronowski, who is the Sydney Nano Deputy, and I got together in late 2019, pre-COVID, and we'd get together for a beer and really talk about how Sydney Nano and the Faculty of Medicine and Health could work together to enable a more coordinated and integrated approach to nanomedicine. And in early 2020, just before COVID set in, we were thrilled to host Professor Paul Weiss, who's a very distinguished professor from the University of California, Los Angeles. And arguably he is internationally one of the more preeminent academics. He's the editor for chief of ACS Nano, and he's a real movement shaker. And he gave a great public lecture on nanomedicine and really set the scene for the nano health medicine conversation. We had a panel discussion with Shelley Nano and Julie Kearney and Paul, and we ended up out for dinner. And in fact, Mark, Paul, Wojtek, and Anna and I ended up in a whiskey bar in the city until the early hours of the morning. But it was a great discussion. And what we really conceived there was the idea of creating this network that would connect expertise and capabilities. We started by bringing a group of researchers together across those key faculty areas, FMH, science, engineering, but also we had involved in that conversation academics from the Faculty of Business. We had academics involved from the social sciences. We had representation from the Brain and Mind Institute. We had from the Office of Research Strategy, Rebecca Murray's team. And through a detailed consultation, capability mapping, we were able to define the building blocks of the network that I'll talk to you about in the next 10 minutes in terms of these specific capability areas, these clusters that really define where we think at the moment, the University of Sydney has critical mass and some leadership, in particular where we can bring together academics from different faculties to collaborate. And so what does that look like? Well, it looks a little bit like this slide here. We can see an outstanding group of mid-career, early career, and well-established academics across the three faculties of concern: Faculty of Medicine and Health, the Faculty of Engineering, and the Faculty of Science. These are all academics that are outstanding in their own right. They've been great to work with as we have formulated the network. And now they are the points of contact for Nanohealth. We want them to be, as part of this Nanohealth network, the co-chairs, the coordinators, if you like, for engaging the broader health and medical ecosystem. So in the panel discussion, when someone says, how do we engage? The answer is going to be the Nanohealth network has been designed to allow you to seamlessly engage with the Nano framework at the University of Sydney in these 6 areas that represent areas of critical masses, threats, and so forth, as I said. In early 2020, going back to my earlier point that the narrative resonates externally, we were fortunate to secure a donation from the University of Sydney alumni who was provided support for the Nanohealth initiative, which has allowed us to employ an absolutely fantastic Senior Research Officer, Ryan Cleary, who I'm sure is in the session today, and is the coordinator of this Nanohealth network that I talked about, liaising with those co-chairs and other stakeholders across the university ecosystem. Earlier in 2021, we put out a great story in the Australian. And for me, this was a bit of a coming of age newspaper article that was trying to get across to the broader community that Sydney Nano had indeed moved to this next stage of its journey, where we had started, as I said, with this physical sciences narrative, that Sydney Nano is now truly multidisciplinary, embracing that whole of university perspective, and that the Nanohealth narrative that the story talks about, if you can Google it, really talks to how we've achieved that. So let me dive in now and start to talk a little bit about some of the specific clusters. I also want to note this slide, which is quite busy, but it also captures the fact that as we formulated the Nanohealth framework, we have consulted with many of the clinicians and academic clinicians linked to the university in the Westmead, the RPA, and North Shore precincts across those 3 local health districts, had some great conversations with those people. And that's really been important in terms of endorsing. And I can tell you, every time we have a conversation with a clinician, it's often difficult to wrap up those conversations because there's so much enthusiasm coming from the clinicians in terms of what the Nanohealth network can offer. So the areas highlighted on the slide here in terms of the disease areas, they're really just proxies for the areas that we focused on. And we obviously want to be more inclusive, but it's fair to say we had great engagement last year with Tania Sorrell and infectious disease. We've got good ongoing engagement with SafeSite and Nanovision. Obviously well connected into the neurological disorders and brain and mind, and cardiovascular is an area of real strength at the University of Sydney. And cancer is clearly a priority, and the antimicrobial resistance is an area of real strength as well. You can also see the many institutes and centres that we consulted with. And I will note that the Faculty of Medicine and Health has recently updated its centre structure. So at some point, we'll update this slide, but for the time being, at least this refers to those organisations and stakeholder groups that we consulted with. So let me focus on a couple of exemplars, and then we'll wrap up. Sensors and diagnostics. This is a topic that's really close to my heart. And this is a conversation that started early 2020, very much in the early phase of COVID, as we were all grappling with what that meant and how we were going to detect signatures of infection, and started a working group with a number of my colleagues in early 2020 to really look at the role that sensors could play in mitigating and really allowing our society to return back to some normality. And in that conversation, we decided to break it down into really 2 specific areas where there is clearly capability. On the one hand, sensors that detect virus, the antibodies, directly. And so this speaks to biosensors, integrated devices that rely on chemistry or biology to detect the infectious disease, whether it's directly the virus or the antibodies. I think you know what I mean. On the other hand, there's another narrative that says, well, that okay, it works, but often when you're in the home or when you're trying to protect a facility or a hospital, you don't have the luxury of being able to do those direct measurements. It would be fantastic if you could detect indirectly physiological signals of infection. For example, a breathalyzer, wearables devices that look for signatures of infectious disease. So it might be looking for patterns in breathing or blood pressure or oxygen levels that reveal infection. And so these conversations went along for a long time, and it got to a point where I said, look, this is great, guys. Every time we meet, someone's got a great idea. we need to decide how to prioritize. And so that segued to a wonderful initiative, I think for me, one of the highlights of 2020, and a great example of the how we do our research, because I think this exemplifies the approach that we take. This is an initiative that Sydney Nano set up with the Infectious Disease Institute that Tania and her colleagues lead. And we relied here on co-design concept. And I was fortunate to run into Professor Alison Tong, who's an absolute rock star researcher in the School of Public Health. And she has an incredible gifted skill to run these co-design frameworks that are incredibly powerful in my experience to highlight, prioritize research, particularly in the context of bringing different stakeholders together. So here we ran, and I won't go into too much detail, but we brought together about 80 people into a virtual room, and we had a conversation where we had clinicians, we had academics and innovators, we had engineers, we had public healthcare professionals, we had people who had recovered from COVID. So this conversation was fascinating to really get an overall perspective on where are the real opportunities for sensors to be used to detect COVID, but also to allow society to return to normal. And look, to cut a long story short, that was published earlier this year in Nature Biotechnology. It's got an author list of about 65, so probably many of the people in this conversation were involved in this. I don't propose to spend any time except to say, please have a look at this paper. It really is more relevant now than it was when we wrote the paper. And it's worth saying that indeed, it was sort of unfortunate that having published the paper, the pressure was taken off and we all sort of moved on as we did in Australia. But of course, with the current circumstances and the realization that COVID is going to be with us for some time to come, there's been an extra emphasis, and there's some really exciting conversations that Sydney Nano is involved in that pick up on this initiative, and really happy to tease that out in the panel discussion. So James, in the last 2 minutes, just to talk to other specific areas of strength, I could talk for half an hour about multifunctional nanoparticles. Anna and Wojtek are more qualified. It's worth saying this is an area where we have real strength, a number of fantastic groups across the university that are synthesizing, developing, applying different types of nanoparticles, whether they are liquid-based, inorganic, carbon, quantum dot-based, or polymeric-based. They're working directly with clinicians, trying to address neurological disorders, respiratory disorders. We've had great engagement, good ongoing engagement with Save Site, treating eye disease and eye disorders. And the final one is to mention lab organ on a chip, another area close to my heart. I think this is an area that Sydney Nano has wanted to see develop further for many years. We've seen some fantastic appointments in the last year. Dr. Danielle Vigolo at the School of Biomedical Engineering brings some really world-class expertise in microfluidics and nanofluidics. Dr. Stefano Palumbo in the School of Physics brings some really fantastic expertise in optical trapping. The narrative really here is to be able to miniaturize that laboratory onto a chip-scale device, and at the same time, the possibility of developing organ-on-chip models that mimic human pathophysiology. And this is an obvious area that University of Sydney researchers are already working on, but these clusters, again, are trying to really consolidate and give structure and coordinate some of these fantastic areas. Finally, just two other initiatives that might resonate. We have, in parallel to Nanohealth, an exciting partnership with the Faculty of Engineering on smart, sustainable buildings, which is attempting to completely reimagine building design and construction to be sustainable, so clearly aligned with those UN sustainability goals. And finally, I'm very excited to say that University of Sydney was co-founded with Waterloo Institute of Nanotechnology. We set up earlier this year the International Network for Sustainable Nanotechnology, which is uniting the world's nano institutes to promote nanotechnology for sustainability. So with that, James, I want to just acknowledge my colleagues, academics, and my professional staff who support Sydney Nano, and really look forward to the next 45 minutes of discussion. James, over to you. Thanks very much.
So we're now at the panel discussion section. This panel discussion is on the theme of bridging multidisciplinary research in nanotechnology with translational health outcomes. Our special guests today, we've got Ben, who will stay on the line. Thanks, Ben. We've got Dr. Laurence from CSIRO, who have recently brought their CSIRO presence onto the Westmead precinct through their business units of digital health and nutrition and health. Great to have you, Laurence. We've got Professor Corinne Caillaud from the University of Sydney, Professor Vitali Sintchenko, Dr. David Martinez, and of course, Professor Tania Sorrell, who will moderate today's discussion. Good to see you, Tania. You all ready to go?
Yes, thank you, James.
Take it away.
So good afternoon, everybody. Ben Eggleton has given us what I would have to say is an extraordinary menu of opportunities, almost too many to really encapsulate in a short period of time. But what we would like to do with this particular part of the presentation is for me to talk initially to 4 panelists, 2 of them from Sydney Nano, Vitali Sintchenko, whose outstanding work in genomics and its potential links to Sydney Nano from our own Westmead precinct, and as James has told you, Laurence Wilson from another of our precinct partners, namely CSIRO. So I'm going to start off with asking a few questions of each of the panelists, and towards the end, there'll be an opportunity for you, as James said, to post some questions in the chat. What we want to do really is sort of explore opportunities that may not have previously been thought of, or if they have, how we can really apply them to our own precinct-based research in a sort of perhaps strategic way, but one that will potentially lead to transformational outcomes. And so I'm going to just briefly ask each panelist to introduce themselves and then come up with an idea. And I'll start off with you, Corinne, because you happen to be on the left-hand side of my screen, to just give a very quick self-introduction, what fresh perspective you would like to come up with, and what you think might be the lowest hanging fruit in your domain expertise that our researchers at Westmead could engage with.
Thank you, Tania, and thank you, Ben, for an amazing presentation. I think I will define myself as an innovator in digital health and really focusing on self-monitoring. So I think we have a keyword here, which is around the monitoring of physiological condition or characteristics, which links me into nano. My work is really multidisciplinary by nature, and I have a focus on adolescents and women's health as well. I would say that really I've got a health background, and what brought me really in that mix, and really I think seeing how much or how many opportunities it has is in bringing really new ways to sense what's happening in our body in different circumstances. So my background is as well exercise science, so I'm very excited as well to see all of the opportunities to understand how our physiology, our health could be monitored, and could be how the changes could be monitored, so we can diagnose potentially more precisely, and potentially as well identify a trajectory of health. So I think in terms of the low-hanging fruits, I think there's already quite a number of solutions and sensors that have been developed by our researchers in Nano. And I can see how they could be potentially, embedded in a system that would non-invasively be able to capture signature of health or signature of infections. And I think this is really something that's really possible in quite short term. What we need is to have, I think, researchers at Westmead, for example, researchers in health, really coming to the clusters or the Nanohealth group and share their problems and ideas, and we can all start to work together. I think it's really about engaging with each other.
So what you're talking about is primarily the nanosensing, physiological sensing side of the enterprise?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm thinking as well, you know, we've seen wearables. So wearables is one of the options. So embedding, you know, nanotechnology on our body to try to sense what's happening. But what I'm thinking as well, and I think Ben touched on that, was remote sensing. And I think in terms of remote sensing, there's lots of opportunities as well to better understand in a really non-invasive way and non-obstructive way to assess different parameters or different dimensions of health.
Okay, so the audience, if you'd like to be thinking about specifics, we can come back and circle back later on in the conversation. I'd also now like to ask David Martinez-Martin to give us his perspective as another member of Sydney Nano. Recognising, David, you do have to leave a little earlier for another meeting, so take it away.
Thank you very much, Tania. Well, so in terms of the type of research that I'm focused on is trying to find new and more accurate biomarkers for health and disease. And these usually actually require us to develop our own instrumentation, which we do also within Sydney Nano. And we work at different scales from single molecule, single cell levels to all the way up to vital signs research. So your question about low-hanging fruits, I think there are a few that we can enable with nanotechnologies. Definitely one of them is what I think is going to be quite feasible is the detection or better detection of disease, in particular subtypes of cancer, and do that based not on biochemical markers, but actually also using the biophysical markers like changes of the mechanical properties at the tissue level at the nanoscale. Which I think now the field has a maturity level that enables the translation to do that. I think there are very clear demonstrated examples in breast tissue, but also in other tissues as well. So I believe this would be a fantastic way to proceed with many of the people in Westmead, as well as using also other kind of properties that we can detect now at the single level of cells, which would be something like the real time mass of a cell, of how within milliseconds we can monitor those changes that identify what the cell is doing, and many of those processes, such that we can understand cell death related issues, cell growth, and many other processes that when they get dysregulated, they are linked to pathologies. I think you're muted, Tania.
Pardon me. The basics of the work that you're doing then could apply to any kind of cell from any organ. You've chosen to talk about cancer, but is it equally applicable to chronic diseases that might affect the heart or the respiratory system, or even in relation to infections?
Well, absolutely. Infections and the other type of diseases, I mean, all of them, and there are very clear examples in the literature, right, where we know that dysregulation, for instance, of cell death is linked to neurological disease, to obviously in a heart attack, you have also a big problem with increased cell death. And obviously in terms of other diseases like infectious diseases, we are thinking that because now we have the capability to detect even the submass of a single cell, detecting or developing antivirals could be also a very quick application where with a minute amount of sample, we are able to detect, how the proliferation of those pathogens are happening and put them in different antibiotics and then try to detect very quickly in less than a couple of hours what is the right antibiotic, for instance, to give to a patient. So I think there are many possibilities that we have or we can enable with those type of technologies.
And final initial question to you. Is the work you're doing envisaged more in the area of diagnostics, or is it potentially related to therapeutics?
Well, it enables both. At the moment, we are more focused in diagnostics, but learning how this process works, it will also enable the development of new drugs or new targets. Once you know how the process works, obviously, then it opens up a new range of possibilities and will give you also the idea on how the new drugs and what kind of processes you need to target.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Vitali, I'm going to ask you to talk next. Just briefly to introduce yourself. You probably need no introduction, but also what are the low-hanging fruit that you could see Sydney Nano interacting with you on?
Thanks, Tania. I'm a clinical microbiologist and academic with Sydney Medical School based at Westmead, and I've spent last 18 months in the lab at Westmead, pretty much doing genomic surveillance for COVID-19, and our team has been instrumental in providing this surveillance for New South Wales Health and nationally and internationally. And it leads me to the concept of linking actually diagnostics and therapeutics that Tania has alluded to, and David Martinez-Martin just mentioned. We have been working at Sydney Medical School on concepts of precision medicine, personalized medicine, precision public health, pretty much leveraging on a growing number of instruments, data types. Genome sequencing is genomic data is one of them that can be utilized to personalize, to make treatment more targeted, more fine-tuned to specific condition, to specific host, and to specific intervention. And I think it might be not necessarily the very low-hanging fruit, but it could be really transformational, as Ben mentioned, to use computational nanomedicine, computational microbiology, and computational virology, essentially by definition would be nanomedicine because they're so small. When we acknowledge now that viruses mutate frequently, and these changes have profound impact on the evolution of pandemics, evolution of disease, as well as on selection of therapeutics. And we have in COVID scenario, which I'm sure will be utilized in the future, we managed, and Eddie Holmes released genomic data for COVID-19. One of our colleagues at the University of Sydney, within weeks, have been essentially suggestions for vaccine design. Within several months, there have been suggestions for therapeutic cocktails for antibodies, specifically targeting different variants of the virus. We have 3 million already sequences of SARS-CoV-2 in a public domain, and this number will grow further, I'm sure, and will be thousands and thousands of genomes for other organisms. So there is a huge potential to identify the pathogen very quickly, to have fine scale information about this pathogen, genome sequence of the pathogen, for example, and design N+1 intervention to treat this pathogen. So this is really combination of lab on a chip with sensor diagnostics, with computational microbiology and modeling of this intervention before you give the drug to your patient. Thank you.
It's an amazing vision for the future, really, isn't it? Thanks very much, Vitali. I'd now like to ask Laurence Wilson to briefly introduce himself and to see where you view the low-hanging fruit in this opportunity, Laurence.
Thanks, Tania, and thanks, Ben, for a great talk. So I'm Laurence Wilson. I lead the digital genome engineering team in the eHealth program at CSIRO. We're a computational team focused on AI and machine learning approaches for genome engineering applications in spaces like precision health and biosecurity. One of the areas I think this kind of work could have a real impact sort of in the near future is on the idea of sort of data accessibility. I know Corinne and Vitali have both mentioned sort of this censoring and all this sort of genome tracing all of which sort of generates massive amounts of data. And there's a real, I guess, barrier to getting access to that data in a usable way. And one of the areas our team is focused on, and I know a lot of other groups around the world are focused on, are building sort of new platforms and pipelines that make it really easy to share that data, make it accessible, and actually start doing things with it. Because at the moment, like Vitali said, there's over 3 million sequences of COVID available worldwide, which is a huge amount of data. And it takes quite a specialized skill set to be able to really do anything with that, with the current sort of infrastructure and platforms that are available. So building new technologies that make that more accessible would mean more people would have access to the data, more people would be able to do things with it, which I think would just be transformative in the way in what could actually get done and at the speed at which it could be done.
Thank you very much, Laurence. I'll just now just briefly look at a couple of questions that are in the chat, and perhaps start off with one. Ben Eggleton, are you in a position to tell us what about the pollution caused by nanoparticles? I think you alluded to it actually, not so much in terms of the word pollution, but can you just speak to that? One of the questioners is interested.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we refer to it as toxicity. So indeed, one of the grand challenge projects that you heard briefly about indeed is Safe by Design. So it really is about providing that thought leadership on nanotechnology and it being sustainable in terms of the toxicity issue. So I would defer to my colleagues in the School of Pharmacy to speak with greater authority on that. But there's a lots of expertise in that area. Understanding, advising government, helping to regulate nanotechnology is an active conversation that my colleagues in medicine pharmacy are having with the Faculty of Law, because there are areas where that's not necessarily well regulated. And just more generally providing that thought leadership into the community and making sure that there are no misconceptions. It's interesting, the network I refer to at the end of my presentation, the Nano for Sustainability Network, which is really trying to unite the world nano institutes to provide a coordinated front. It has on the one hand an explicit focus on the UN sustainability goals. So it says we're going to use nanotechnology to address them, but actually it also is wanting to ensure that nanotechnology is sustainable, that we don't end up through misunderstanding, through fake news, that nanotechnology isn't translated into practice because these misunderstandings around toxicity. So yeah, good topic.
Thanks very much, Ben. There's another one, there's a rather specific one from Miriam, who's a physicist who graduated from ANU and has been to many universities and research groups. And I think she'd like to know how welcome such people are made by society in everyday life. In other words, I think you're alluding to the co-design principles you were talking about, Ben, and how that might then work for, whoops, someone's just deleted the question. Oh. How that might actually work for interactions with higher level industry in the longer term.
Well, I think it can be very powerful. I'm not sure if I'm getting the essence of the question, but I think the co-design concept, that design thinking, is, for me, a contemporary approach to how we formulate research priorities. It's a way of using well-established techniques, and I work with colleagues in the School Faculty of Architecture, Design and Planning and the School of Public Health, and I've used that co-design approach very effectively on a number of occasions, and it's very powerful. Alison Hong is fantastic. She just got a big NHMRC grant, and she'll be doing more of it. So I think absolutely, if you're asking whether we should also be bringing industry into that conversation, absolutely spot on. Probably there's a separate discussion that would look at manufacturing. I think it's worth saying that part of Sydney Nano strategy is also the notion that not only do we see nanotechnology addressing the grand challenges and helping improve health outcomes, but we'd like to see a nanotechnology ecosystem. We'd like to see in Sydney and nationally that we recognise there's an opportunity to grow that industry. So yes, we should, and I think the Nanohealth Network is looking at doing it. I think that is indeed the plan, to have roundtables with industry, bring industry into the conversation.
So Ben, if there are early career researchers or potential postdocs listening in today, how do they get in touch with you and find out more about what postdocs might be available?
Yeah, good question. So remember, firstly, Sydney Nano is an umbrella. We represent our constituents, our stakeholders are the schools and faculties. So the schools and faculties are always the home for postdocs and students. I think the Nano framework provides that context and that construct for some of these multidisciplinary conversations. So I would say, go to the website, Google Sydney Nanohealth, and you'll find a nice page that outlines the 6 clusters that I talked about briefly, and there are co-chairs. They are points of contact within the schools to start conversations about, indeed, PhD projects, postdocs. And if we were open, I would also say, come and see us. We love nothing more than hosting anyone, taking them through the nanoscience building and talking to what the nano agenda is about, and then connecting you with the relevant research leaders in the different disciplines. Okay, now there's a specific question about, is there a role for nanotechnology in radiation oncology? I guess, Corinne, you don't want to address that directly. We better do it to Ben, is that right?
Yeah, this one is a bit of a stretch out of my direct field, but I would think that yes, there is a place. I mean, in terms of imaging, I think there's a huge role for potentially, radio sensors or different probes that would support imaging. So I think there's a huge space here for nano in the cancer area for imaging and potentially for treatment. Absolutely, yes. And this is typically a question that, could be shared across the different clusters, and we can discuss, and the first conversation could be organized quite quickly. I think, this is what is important in what we're trying to do is, I think that aspects that people feel empowered, that they can just, drop an email to any of the co-chairs of the different clusters and start a conversation.
Okay, look, I think that's fine, unless you want to add something, Ben.
Oh, I was just going to say, no, Corinne knows that topic better than I do. I was just in an emailing Mark Rees, and I wonder if he's still here. We've got a parallel initiative on quantum technology, and as part of quantum technology, there's some interesting possibilities with quantum sensors, that quantum sensors can be used to image. And I'd like Mark to respond to my email. So that's just a call out to Mark if he's listening.
Matilda has just put in a website into the chat, which I've inadvertently deleted, Matilda, but it is the route directly into Sydney Nano if people are interested in finding out more about it and contacting them. So wait for that to come back up. There was a question before on from an individual who's interested in neurophysiology. And clearly, I guess the brain-mind center would be the logical connection there. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, look, Omid Kabahay, who is in the School of Biomedical Engineering, is a point of contact there. But there are plenty of people, of course, the brain and mind, you want to go straight to the experts, depending on what perspective they're taking on that issue. Okay. Question from Roger Riddell. Is any work being done on indoor air quality? That's a really big deal in health. That's a good question. I can speak to that. Yeah, that's a good question. And it comes up in the context of the Smart Sustainable Building Initiative that I talked about at the end of my presentation, which is a sort of relatively recent initiative with the Faculty of Engineering, and that is looking at reimagining building design to be more sustainable. And it's taking a human-centric perspective. So indeed, and I think, Corinne, you might be part of that conversation. I'm not sure, but we've certainly got people from FMH, including Ollie J, and from Architecture, Design and Planning, Richard Adair, who's an authority on indoor air quality. So indeed, that is a priority. We know that indoor air quality matters, and we know that we have to reimagine how these buildings are designed to make sure that A, they are sustainable, and B, that they are healthy. At the risk of putting the focus back on infectious disease, Ben, I think you've got a couple of grand challenges out at the moment that relate to detecting things in the air, not least of which is a certain virus that seems to be consuming our attention. Indeed. Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's fair to say that, we had that great initiative last year, and then it we kind of lost focus of it, but it's come back, and there's a lot of great capacity. In fact, we need to chat to both you and Vitali about a conversation we're having with a company that we think has got some interesting possibilities, but we'll do that offline.
Now, there is one more question. In the opinion of the panel, what's the most exciting innovation in the nanohealth field coming through the pipeline or clinical trials? And what key health problem is it solving or revolutionizing? So I think the question is to each panelist. So we'll give Ben a rest for a start. And maybe Laurence, since you went last before, you'd like to go first this time.
Yeah, for sure. So I think probably the thing in this space that's gotten me the most excited recently has been sort of the release of the new AlphaFold, Google's protein folding technology, so the model for predicting protein folding, which I think is really, really cool. It's a very good technology. It seems to work really well. We're already using it for things like viral vector design for gene therapy applications. But what's gotten me most excited about it is this sort of spin-off initiative from AlphaFold called CollabFold, which is where essentially they've set up an online server where anyone can access AlphaFold through a website. You don't need to set anything up. You don't need to understand how it works, but you can basically submit your protein structure and your protein sequence and immediately start generating potential structures, which I just think is a fantastic way to reduce that barrier and get people using it. And it's something we're already using it. I've got undergrad students in my team who spend all day just submitting sequences and seeing what they can do with it. But I think it's that kind of initiative where people are getting some like amazing new technology and then just immediately making it completely accessible. That's gotten me really excited about it.
Okay, thank you. Corinne, what's exciting you most? What's the best innovation that you're aware of?
Yeah, well, I think what really excites me is to, I think would be to not potentially focusing on one single innovation, but trying to understand how a set of different sensors could provide live information and continuous monitoring of people, and particularly in response for specific therapeutics, for example, or specific intervention. I think that would be a huge support for clinicians to understand how a particular person, responds to a particular therapeutic and to adjust treatment. So it's really going into the personalization of treatment from information collected by sensors.
So if you're going to do that, you're going to have to help us solve another problem, because if we're continuously collecting data, that gives us so much data, we don't know how to handle it.
Yeah, well, that's one aspect, but maybe we don't need to continuously record data all the time. I think we need to target, time windows where that would be very effective and where the information that's collected is actually useful. But with my team as well, we work on how we can use this data to provide meaningful feedback to the persons as well. So it brings into the mix the self-monitoring and self-assessment. So placing the human or the person or the patient at the center.
Yeah,
this is the opportunity that's going to be as well very exciting.
I'm just giving you a hard time. Vitali, what's the most exciting innovation from your point of view?
Well, as Corinne, rather than cherry picking one, well, I'm really excited about nanorobots. I think they have huge potential in many aspects of preventative health and reactive health and treatment. As a microbiologist, I'm very excited about now capacity, first models, computational models of bacteria that have been designed to test their susceptibility or resistance to antibiotics in a most efficient way, in most close way to reality. And I think Again, David mentioned antibiotic susceptibility testing in real time as one of the priorities. So this is just a very exciting opportunity. And these models utilize deep learning in a feedback loop that would fit fantastically well in quantum computing, and will improve turnaround time for this, make it actionable. Essentially, whatever we do, we have to produce results in actionable time to make a difference. So I think this is just a really paradigm shifting opportunity in front of us. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Vitali. There is another question that I haven't come to so far, and that's that different disciplines often speak with different professional or academic languages. In a multidisciplinary approach, how have you seen communications across different fields done well to get better outcomes? Okay. Well, we'll actually put you on the spot, Ben, because we'll let the other panelists have a think about it.
Yeah, what's the magic bullet? Look, it is hard. And I think for Sydney Nano, it's even harder because not only are we here science, engineering and medicine, and I think science and engineers roughly are the same. And then with clinicians and medicos, it's sort of understanding managing expectations is really important. And then getting to a point where you understand the clinicians often don't necessarily understand what's possible. And then the innovators don't understand what the use case is. And so meeting in the middle, I think co-design was very powerful at bringing the consensus and converging. We have the extra dimension that we also engage the social sciences and the business school and the law faculty, and I have to deal with heads of schools and faculty. So there is a bit of an art. In fact, I was having this conversation last week with Mark Scott, the VC, about the challenge of stakeholder engagement across the broader university, that everyone has different expectations. What is success and how do we unify that? I don't know what the magic sauce is. I think for me, it's about, we've got a clear strategy and we're driving towards those transformative and translational outcomes. And for me, I sort of have enough knowledge about enough things that I can help put people in the room and then get out of the way unless I'm helping. So for me, that's my gift, is that I know when I can add value and I know when I get out of the way.
Excellent. Is anyone else wish to comment from the panel? Laurence, then Corinne.
Sorry, yeah, I'll just say I think because similar to Ben, I've been involved in conversations that have gone well, and I've been involved in conversations that have not gone so well. But I think the big difference in when something has succeeded from a multidisciplinary, I guess, collaboration is that we managed to get really early on, nail down what the goal was and make it really clear what is the problem we're actually trying to solve. What does success actually look like? And just keeping that in mind and going from there. So really understanding what you're trying to achieve and why. Because I mean, I'm a chronic case of this. I see a new technology, a new toy, I get excited and I want to use it. But that sometimes you don't need the shiniest, newest thing. You just need something good. And so having a really clear understanding of what problem you're actually trying to solve and what will actually be useful to the end user. So engaging them like really early so that everyone can be on the same page, managing expectations, as Ben said, and really knowing what it is what problem it is you're trying to solve.
Thanks, Laurence. And Corinne.
Yeah, well, exactly, I think along the line of what I wanted to say. So start today and yeah, absolutely have the conversation, be ready to listen, to be wrong sometime, and just keep the conversation going and co-design the objectives as well. I mean, it's a very good way to do it. This is what I wanted to add.
Okay.
And I just said, maybe Tania, I mean, I love what Laurence and Corinne said, but the grand challenge framework has been very powerful because nothing unites a group of people more than a very specific challenge. Everyone gets on board, everyone's united. There are language barriers, but you all come together because you want to address this grand challenge. That works really well.
Thanks. There's a question from Keith. Nature has given us many examples of nanomachines. The ribosome and flagellum come to mind. When do the panelists think there will be equivalent synthetic machines? Okay, I'm going to ask Vitali. Is this a tough question for you, Vitali?
Well, in many ways, we're already using synthetic machines, bioengineered nanopores, for example, for sequencing organisms, including coronavirus. There's Oxford Nanopore Technologies. This is really part of E. coli kind of machinery, which we put on a chip yep. and utilize over and over to drag this DNA through the pore and read the signal. So it's happening already. I think we're leveraging on these nanotechnologies. Yes, it's very captivating ideas, very exciting opportunities that would motivate minds from different specialties and make this multidisciplinary networks very productive. Thank you.
Corinne, what's a synthetic machine that you can envisage from your area of interest?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question because I think observation of nature at the nanoscale, plants and insects in particular, have brought very interesting structures. And I think Ben talked about that, but for example, hydrophobic leaves, for example, could be very interesting in designing new coating, for example, on surfaces. So I think that, it's difficult to say which one would, be the winning in the future, but I can see how much opportunities, with coating, you can imagine surfaces wouldn't attract viruses, for example. So you protect people at the same time, or if you try to detect what's happening in a room, for example. I like as well the idea that some people have used the structures of webs as well to design nanomaterials that have specific strengths and resistance to different situations. So I think I'm not sure I can exactly answer the question, but I can see that there's lots of value in observing nature, which brings as well, the multidisciplinary aspects of the nanoscience and the nano field, because, we may need more people studying insects and bring them together in the room and just be open that they can bring some amazing information about existing nanostructures that could be helpful in health as well.
So Laurence, you have 1 minute to provide your view.
I'll move fast. I think I don't know about a truly synthetic nanomachinery, because I'm sort of of the opinion that sort of any idea I have or any idea we have, nature's probably already done it. And I think there's certainly ways we can leverage what nature has done in new ways. And I think the sort of perfect example of this is the CRISPR-Cas system, which was a bacterial immune system, has now been leveraged to become this really powerful genome engineering tool to change the DNA of a living organism. But even then, people are continuing to build and innovate on it. And so you've now got CRISPR-Cases or other Cas systems that can change the epigenetics of a environment, can be used as an amazing biosensor for diagnostic processes or just monitoring populations in the wild. So I think that's a real example where just innovating on what nature's already done can be really powerful, rather than this trying to build something synthetic from scratch.
I think that's a really interesting observation, and obviously a true one, that actually if we can observe nature closely enough, we'll have most of the approaches we'll need in medicine. Now I'd like to just throw back to Ben to make a final comment on this question, and then I think it's to James to wrap up. So Ben, you've got 1 minute also.
On that question, that's a hard one to follow up. I love the idea of being inspired by nature, and I think that is indeed happening. And I think also we should acknowledge that there's enormous progress in technology. So Moore's law the IT industry is driving enormous progress in chip design. The size of transistors is getting smaller and smaller. The ability to do processing at the edge, AI, quantum computing, indeed, Vitali, is going to be around the corner, and we're going to be able to do, again, this is the Mark Reese has got to respond to my email. We are trying to apply quantum computing to applications in medicine and health very soon, and we're going to be able to compute things at breathtaking speeds. And so I think there's a hybrid approach that's intriguing. I know that when we looked at the nanorobotics sort of early on, the strategy that Sydney Nano was looking at was actually a hybrid. You're going to take some CMOS technology and we're going to combine it with some biocompatible, approach and bring the best of both worlds together to do something that is truly, has that functionality and even the computational processing embedded within it. So I just think that we're still early on in this journey, and over the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be fantastically exciting.
Thanks, Ben. Back to you, James.
Thank you so much, Tania, and to all our panelists. If you want to learn more about Westmead Research Hub, please visit our website or send us an email. Get in touch, tell us what you thought about today's webinar. I'm hoping we can make it available after today for anyone who missed it. Also follow at Sydney Nano on social media if you want direct updates from Ben and Ben's team. And in summary,